Well, get ready, Mopar fans, because today we're going to talk about something that many Mopar fans may not know about, and that is that Chrysler, for many years, actually produced boat engines and boats. Yes, they had a marine division all the way up until, I believe, 1979, at which point they were forced to divest it as part of the government bailout. But Chrysler and its history with marine items really dates back to the late 1920s when Walter P. Chrysler was still in charge and decided that it should enter into the marine industry because it was rapidly expanding and seemed like a natural fit for Chrysler's engines to be employed. In fact, in 1928, Chrysler introduced a new six-cylinder flathead marine motor with an attached marine transmission and freshwater cooling system, and it was bought by Chrysler-Built. So Chrysler, for those who don't know, is a very famous maker of high-end boats, and this really started the relationship between Chris-Craft and Chrysler. Chrysler was in fact so successful with some of its early efforts in the marine power industry that in the 1940s it allegedly had about 40% market share of all inboard motors, and Chrysler by this point was effectively spending money and time to convert its gasoline-powered engines that were employed in cars to use in marine equipment. And that may not be as easy as it sounds. Of course, you have the basics of the engine, but one of the tougher elements is making sure that all of the exhaust manifolds are water-cooled, as an example, because marine engines are operating at higher stress points over longer periods of time than cars. So this was no small feat, but Chrysler executed it successfully. Now, in the 1950s and early 1960s, Chrysler kind of started diversifying into more of a conglomerate. And not only did they have, let's say, this marine division that was burgeoning and kind of taking off, but they also expanded into other areas, like with the air temp division. You could buy a Chrysler furnace or an air conditioner back then. Many people don't know that. And of course, Chrysler would procure the Simca automobile company overseas. So Chrysler was starting to really spread its wings, and one of the things that it thought it should do is, given its success in the marine industry, expand into that industry even further. After all, by this point, Chrysler had been producing marine engines for decades. In fact, take a look here at this picture. This is a 331 Chrysler Hemi that has been converted to marine power. This was one of the best engines of the era to power boats from an inboard perspective. And so in 1965, this was really a pivotal year for Chrysler Marine, as Chrysler made two acquisitions that would really help set the stage for their expansion in this industry. One of which was West Bend Outboard Motors, and this was located in Hartford, Wisconsin, just northwest of Milwaukee. West Bend at the time had about 1/3 of the market share of all outboard engines that were sold in the United States. And you might not recognize the West Bend name, but they did produce outboard motors for Elgin and Sears. Those were the principal brands that sold West Bend outboards. And unfortunately, West Bend didn't have the best reputation for quality. They were known for having some issues from that standpoint, as well as having relatively noisy outboard engines. So it sounds like the perfect acquisition, right? Buying let's say, a maker of outboard engines that didn't have the best reputation in the business. But it was a great way for Chrysler to really get into the outboard space. They had been in the inboard space with the engines that I had previously described for a number of years, and I think they felt that they could use their engineering prowess and know-how to really expand into the outboard motor space. So Chrysler acquired, as I mentioned, West Bend in 1965, and that became the Chrysler Outboard Corporation division. And Chrysler did really re-engineer their engines to become much more reliable. I won't say that they became any quieter than competitors. Chrysler Outboards were known for their durability. Aside from some of the 85 horsepower engines had some issues, but in general, they were very durable. I don't know that they were necessarily any less noisy, let's say, but they were known to be durable products. Now, in 1965, Chrysler also acquired Lone Star Boat from Plano, Texas, and that became the Chrysler-Built Corporation division. Now, interestingly, and I think coincidentally, this wasn't necessarily planned, but Lone Star, the year before, had introduced a new boat for 1964 that was named the Barracuda. Well, what did Chrysler also introduce in 1964? The Barracuda. Of course, the boat was a boat. The car was a car. The boat was a 13-footer, kind of a small, nice-looking little boat. And in any case, Chrysler then integrated the new Outboard Corporation as well as the Chrysler-Built Corporation into its Marine and Industrial Products division, which was part of Chrysler's Diversified Products Group at the time. Back to remember what I said about Chrysler trying to diversify themselves into being more of a conglomerate. Remember, back during this time frame, conglomerates were kind of all the rage. General Motors didn't just produce cars, they also produced appliances like refrigerators and washing machines. Ford had a tractor division. AMC had Nash Calvinator, the refrigerator division. They had Wheel Horse, the tractor division. So all of the auto companies were kind of branching out into different areas beyond just cars. And that was because the companies were quite highly valued, and investors seemingly were interested in the companies taking on more items. After all, it was felt that there were synergies between these businesses and the car companies themselves. Think about the Chrysler Marine division. They were just effectively converting gas car engines over to inboard engines for some time, and they could use their engineering know-how to make outboards as well as boats. From a GM and AMC standpoint, they could clearly use their engineering know-how in refrigeration to make refrigerators. Refrigeration cycles are the same, no matter if they're in a car or they're in a refrigerator. It doesn't really matter. And I think the other thing here was the companies were relatively highly valued, and one of the things that was beneficial for conglomerates at the time is you could buy a company that was, let's say, struggling but had some revenue. And if you bolted it on to the broader company, like a GM or a Chrysler that was highly valued, you effectively took a company that had a low valuation, and now all of a sudden, just by being affiliated and part of the larger company, it now had a higher valuation. So that was the theory behind conglomerates. And for those who are interested in business history, I don't think that's the purpose of this channel, but you've seen clearly, let's say, a decline in the number of conglomerates that has occurred over the past couple years, whether that's General Electric that is split into three, Honeywell that is split into three, Siemens, etc. Although there are still some big conglomerates, Amazon would be a great example of one that's clearly in a number of diversified spaces. In any case, the venture into boating was really something that was, quite interesting to Chrysler and unique. Neither Ford nor GM really ventured into that space, although they did produce engines for the boating industry. They never made boats themselves. Lone Star Boats was really the interesting piece in the acquisition for Chrysler because Lone Star made fiberglass and aluminum boats, and the aluminum ones were, I would say, generally well regarded by the buying public. And from the perspective of the fiberglass ones, this was really a relatively new technology that was starting to take off in terms of boating. In fact, under Chrysler's leadership, the new boating division developed a Hydro V hull that had a deep V hull design, and it was great for lateral stability. Chrysler made various boats employing this hull in 6 versions from 14 to 23 feet long, and amazingly, Chrysler was able to achieve almost 50% market share of the marine market at one point in time. And that was because they really had great, let's say, engineering in their boats. I already mentioned that they reworked the West Bend outboards, but you can imagine Chrysler had great expertise in electrical wiring, as an example, and really helped to make, let's say, wiring in their boats be relatively robust and reliable. That was something that some of the boats of the time, you just really couldn't say that about them. And one of the boats that employed this Hydro V type hull was the Chrysler Charger, a 16-foot boat that actually employed a steering wheel from the Dodge Charger. Hey, why not? Why not use the steering wheel from your cars? And Hot Boat at the time, that was a well-known magazine, called the boat a well-executed and beautifully conceived job. So Chrysler boats were really ahead of their time, in part because they were fiberglass and they had foam construction as well that would help insulate the hulls from their various shocks and provide additional strength, as well as help make them quiet. Now, in 1967, Chrysler brought out a cathedral hull, which spanned an entirely new line of boats. And of course, what did Chrysler do? Name these all after cars. So there, as an example, was the 16-foot Fury and Sport Fury runabout, as well as a bow rider. And the bestseller was the 15-foot Sport Satellite bow rider. So Chrysler was kind of having a little bit of fun with some of their various boats of the era. And why not? It was really cool. They, again, were able to use not only their engineering prowess on the engines and the electronics, but they could also use some parts like steering wheels in their boats. And in general, Chrysler, by 1969, just a few years after acquiring both the West Bend Company as well as Lone Star Boats, had 46 models in their lineup. Everything from a 12-foot fishing boat to a 24-foot cruiser that could use a modified Nissan diesel engine as well as a Chrysler engine. And at this point, Chrysler started renaming their boats a little bit. They still named them after cars, but they had a number that was attached to them at the end, like the Chrysler Charger 183, and that's because it had a hull capacity of 183 cubic feet. At the same time, the outboard division was really firing on all cylinders. Terrible pun, but I used it anyway. And they had 40 different engines by the late 1960s, everything from a 3.5 horsepower at the low end to a 135 horsepower engine at the upper end. So just a huge amount of offerings. Chrysler Outboards by that point were in fact already sold in 125 countries. There are only 185-ish countries in the entire world. So it was a highly successful operation. As the years would go on, Chrysler would continue to expand their availability of outboards as well as inboard engines. You could get inboard engines, including the 440 that had 3 two barrels as an as an inboard motor in your boat. And you could get the 383, the 340, the 318, so many different engine offerings. By 1971, Chrysler came out with a series of new fiberglass sport boats, some other outboards, as well as even more inboard outboard style boats to continue completing their overall lineup. And Chrysler really continued to invest in the marine division all the way through the late 1970s. They restyled their outboard line in 1977. They introduced new lines of boats in the 1970s. I should also mention that Chrysler produced not only power boats, but also sailboats during this time frame. And one other little interesting tidbit of information is that the Chrysler acquired Lone Star boats shared the Chrysler Lone Star label for, I believe, one model year after they were acquired. So kind of like the Pontiac Star Chief Executive for 1966, you could get a Chrysler Lone Star boat for that 1 year after the acquisition. So what happened? Well, in the late 1970s, clearly Chrysler was in trouble as a company overall, and it was felt that they wouldn't survive. In fact, obviously, Chrysler had to go to the government and get a bailout during that time frame, for which Lee Iacocca famously advocated for the company to get that bailout from the government. And as part of that, they had to end up divesting their marine division. So the final year of Chrysler Marine was 1979, and it's kind of unfortunate. In 1978 and 1979, it was clear that the writing was on the wall. But it actually took until 1984 for Chrysler to divest the outboard motor business. I guess nobody really wanted it. The outboards actually went on to be relabeled Force outboards. So if you see the Force label on some Mercury Marine products of yesteryear, that was where the Force label really started. Chrysler had sold the outboards to U.S. Marine in 1984. It eventually ended up as part of Mercury Marine and Brunswick Corporation. But the Force outboard name was really conceived for these Chrysler engines, kind of like the Eagle division of Chrysler was conceived to market these cars that have been developed under the AMC Renault partnership. In any case, Chrysler really produced some interesting boats back in the time frame. Beautiful boats, and it's kind of cool that they employed some various car parts as part of their boat making capabilities. And they're starting to become a little bit of collector items in the marketplace. Now, the collector market for boats is admittedly, let's just say, reduced compared to the collector market for cars. But still, Chrysler boats are something that are starting to become prized by collectors. I, in fact, almost bought one years ago with the trailer. I don't remember the exact model, but it was a beautiful red metallic fiberglass boat with a 55 horsepower Chrysler outboard on it. And I think I could have bought it with the trailer for about $2,500. And it was just perfect. Now today, probably like everything, the prices have gone up, and that boat would be worth $5,000-$6,000, maybe a little bit more, given that it was in mint condition. But if you want one of your Chrysler boats, or you want something and you're a big Mopar fan and have access to a water source and a lake, maybe you should end up picking up a vintage Chrysler boat and enjoy it. Thanks again for watching.